Hello, World History 2 students. This is Mr. Aviunis. Believe it or not, this Module 3 is our second to last module that we'll be doing for the year. So please gear up and get ready to go. As a reminder for our module, you'll be taking notes on this video, and once you're done taking those notes, you should go on and do that web quest. This is a video, so if I do talk too fast or there's too many words on a slide, please feel free to pause the video and take the notes as you see fit. Even though you're not going to have an SOL test on this is still very good information you should know. Also, as I mentioned before, a lot of this information that I'm telling you right now will probably / definitely show up again next year. So it's probably good that you get this information now so you can impress your U.S. history teachers next year. All right, some of those essential questions that we're going to be asking today. How did the Cold War get started after World War II? How did nuclear weapons affect this? What was our relationship with the Soviet Union? And how did the Soviet Union eventually collapse? And now it's Russia. And we're also going to talk about some of our policy conflicts, so like containment policy and a lot of those leaders. You see there's a whole big list of leaders that the state of Virginia really wants you to know. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's start off with, how did the Cold War officially begin? And there's a lot of debate about officially when the Cold War started. So for those who don't know, Cold War is not an actual war. We did not actually fight anyone in the Cold War. It was called cold because there was no firing of guns and therefore not a hot war. So it was really just this state of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, if you recall, we actually were allies during World War II, but even before World War II started ending, we started eyeballing each other because we really did become the top two world powers, and we had conflicting, I guess, political and even economic beliefs on how the world should get run. We were a free enterprise, which means capitalism, and they were more a communism / really a dictatorship under Joseph Stalin. And really, it just became a world of either with us or you're against us. You're either a democratic capitalist society or you're a communist society. And anyone who was neither of those two options, we thought was going to be the enemy. And if you see our picture right here in the bottom left corner of the slide, you can see Europe really gets divided between communist and capitalist democracies. The green is the allies of the United States, the capitalist societies, and then I guess we call that peach color, is the Soviet Union's satellite nations. Satellite nations are countries that are supposedly independent, but really are being highly influenced / controlled by the Soviet Union. And one of the terms we'll talk about later on is the Iron Curtain. And it was a favorite phrase that was made by Woodrow Wilson, the Prime Minister of England, who basically said all the countries that have fallen sway to the Soviet Union are now behind this Iron Curtain, that we can no longer see what's going on and we've lost them. So some of the people traced the beginnings of the Cold War to the Yalta Conference, which was, again, it's actually a meeting during World War II, but you pretty much knew, the Allies pretty much knew they were going to win, so they're just discussing on how they would basically divide the spoils and try to create a new world order after the war officially came to an end. So in this picture, you can see from left to right, you got you have Winston Churchill, my bad, FDR, and you have Stalin. Now, FDR will eventually die very shortly after this meeting, and you'll have Harry Truman who's going to take over, and he's the one that's actually going to finish the war. But anyway, even during this conference, you can see the first signs of tension of that Cold War. Where one of the things that was happening, where Churchill and FDR tried to get Stalin to agree that Eastern Europe should be independent and hold free elections, because we wanted it to be, those countries to be, to have this sovereignty and not be controlled by another power. Now, Stalin took that as a sign that these capitalist powers wanted to destroy communism, and in his mind, he won those countries fair and square. He fought a war, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Soviets died in that war, and it's their right to have those states as a buffer state from those capitalist forces that are trying to destroy them. The other policy that gets made shortly after World War II ends is the idea of containment. And really the idea of containment is, if you look at the map of the world, the Soviet Union becomes communist, eventually China becomes communist, Korea starts becoming communist, Vietnam starts becoming communist, Eastern Europe starts becoming communist. You just see all these different countries are starting to spread communism very quickly. In the United States' mind, communism equals evil. We need to contain this communism from spreading even further, contain basically this ideological virus from spreading to other countries. And that's the big overarching policy that the United States does really for 4 to 5 decades. We can't really prevent communism from where it's already happened, but we need to stop it from spreading to any other places. So I've already mentioned this before, but some of those ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the United States. So again, economically, we are capitalist, which basically means governments hand off, let private businesses do as they may. Whereas the Soviet system, the communist system, the government is much more hands-on. Now, theory, remember, communism is the idea that really shouldn't be any type of government. It should be a completely classless system. Basically, there's no higher class, there's no lower class. Everyone's roughly the same, and they should all be working together in communal harmony. But really, in practice, they're a dictatorship where the government has to basically force people to work on the same thing together. And essentially, you do still have their own version of haves and have-nots, and especially the brutal dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, who did things, if you recall, like the Great Purge, where anyone he thought is a threat to his power or threat to communism, he would either kill or send to Siberia to get rid of them. But really, that's what it came down to, the forces of communism versus the forces of capitalism and democracy. And these little pictures kind of highlight some of the big conflicts that happened during on there. So on the left-hand side, you can see this is a propaganda poster that was made by the United States, where again you can see the communist guy and the Soviet Union getting into the Eastern Europe as well is kind of evil, and it's our job. We have to stop them. The quotes "Red Scare" is a term that you'll learn more about next year as well, which is essentially red stands for communism. So we need to stop the spread of the Reds. Because they are evil and they're trying to infiltrate society and destroy our economy. In fact, there was a lot of scares in the United States that there were secret communists amongst us, especially in Hollywood, who were trying to corrupt society and spy on society, and that we need to stop and guard against them. Another big event I just want to mention mainly because I think it's important and something I hope you'll get to cover more next year is Sputnik. So this Sputnik is the beginning of the space race, and it was actually done by the Soviet Union first in the 1950s. So if you look up in the night sides, there was this mysterious satellite that's orbiting around that Americans could now see and wonder, like, oh no, what are the Soviets doing with that? What is this satellite actually doing? And the Soviets are definitely technologically ahead of us, and we're losing this Cold War. Now, in reality, if you look at Sputnik, it really wasn't that big compared to what we have satellites we have today. It wasn't really super impressive. And also, you can see right there, look at this person right next to it. It really wasn't even that big of a satellite. But Sputnik was the beginning of the space race, which ultimately ends, the United States doing the Apollo missions and going to the moon first. And that was seen as another theater of the Cold War. Who would win going to the moon first? I've already mentioned the Iron Curtain, but just want to reiterate again. This was the term created by Winston Churchill to say basically everyone on the Eastern Europe side, we really couldn't see what's going on anymore. They are now controlled by the Soviet Union, and they're basically lost to the free peoples of the world. All right, so some characteristics of the Cold War, and we'll get into more detail about some of these a little bit later on. We do form military pacts. So NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is Western Europe. Those are the allies of the United States during the Cold War. And the Warsaw Pact is basically Eastern Europe. So those are the allies to the Soviet Union during the war. And essentially, if there ever was a war between the Soviet Union and the United States, Warsaw Pact would go against NATO in that war. And the other, now going on to actual wars, there were a few wars during the Cold War, and these were really called what we call proxy wars. So they weren't directly United States versus Soviet Union, because remember, we never actually fought each other. But maybe we sided different forces during these wars. Forces during these wars. So one example would be the Korean War, where North Korea was communist and South Korea was capitalist, and also in Vietnam, where North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was capitalist. And we got involved in those. I'll talk about more of those later. You also had Berlin Wall and the Berlin Divide. If I can go back on a former slide, and I think I have this on a future slide coming up, where essentially Germany, which remember was a losing power during World War II, we actually divided in half. So basically, you have half of Germany's is capitalist Democrats and half of it's communist. And Berlin was also split in half, the capital, but the capital was surrounded by communists because it was on the communist side of it. So you had this really tiny small island of capitalism surrounded by communism. Cuban Missile Crisis, I will mention on the next slide, so I'll hold off from talking too much about it. And of course, the big thing that hopefully a lot of you guys already know about is the big conflict of nuclear weapons, the idea of mutually assured destruction. We have nuclear bombs, they have nuclear bombs. And one of the reasons why we didn't fight each other, because we knew if we dropped a bomb, they would probably drop a bomb. So mutually assured, we'd both be destroyed if we ever did go into a war. All right, so the first conflict I want to highlight is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you see right here, the picture right here, Cuba is really, really close to the United States, up to 90 miles away from the United States, depending on where you're looking. So if a nuclear bomb was ever stationed in Cuba and then launched in the United States, we probably wouldn't have had a lot of time to react to it, and we would have been in trouble. So a little bit historical context, which again, hopefully you'll learn more about next year. Cuba fell, which we would say, to communism, to Fidel Castro in 1959. And we tried to overthrow Castro in several different ways with the Bay of Pig invasions and whatnot. But eventually we just had to kind of accept that Cuba is communist and we can't actually stop it. Fidel Castro died, I think about 4 years ago, and his brother took over for a few years, but it's still a communist country even to this day. And since Cuba, we were hostile to Cuba, Cuba turned to the next superpower that was also communist, which was the Soviet Union. And again, during this big Cold War going on with the nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union offered to give the Cuba nuclear weapons. And we eventually caught wind that these nuclear bombs, nuclear missiles were coming to Cuba. So we actually put a ring of ships around Cuba and try to blockade Cuba from getting those weapons. So this ended up being a huge standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is one of the big flashpoints when we worried that this would actually start the Cold War, become a hot war between the United States. Eventually, Khrushchev, the current leader of the Soviet Union during that time, agreed to back off and remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba, and Cuba never got those missiles. But again, in the end, Cuba was still communist, and they stayed communist for a very long time. They're still communist today. All right, so these are just some of the images of some of the things I was talking about. So in the top left corner, you can see that red line is the divide and the Iron Curtain. So on the right side, with those kind of pink colors, is the communist sides, and on the green side is NATO slash the capitalist forces. The big picture on the right is a picture of Germany. So the red area is the communist side, and the other colors are different zones that were democracies slash capitalists. And you see those little arrows. Those little arrows are airplanes. And that's just showing you a bit of infographic to a big flashpoint during the Cold War, which is the Berlin airlift, where essentially the Soviet Union tried to blockade Berlin to make it force them to give in and become communist. And we decided, well, we're going to save Berlin and give them resources so they don't fall to communists. So we actually took airplanes and constantly, for several months, dropped off supplies to Berlin so they could stay functioning until eventually the Soviet Union agreed to end the Berlin blockade on their end. And the last map you really can't see really well. As I mentioned, there's a lot of proxy wars, not just in Cuba and Germany and Vietnam and Korea, but you can see I only see little dots. Basically, the United States, we got involved in a lot of little different wars. Any hint that some country was being anti-capitalist, we assumed they'd become communist, and therefore we overthrew a lot of governments to make sure that they are at least pro-capitalist. Maybe not necessarily democratic, but at least pro-capitalist. All right, this image right here is really just representing the Korean War. So you can see at the beginning of the Korean War, North Korea actually almost completely conquers the southern part of Korea. And then the United States, we get involved because we get nervous that we don't want this other area to become communist. And we actually almost conquer all of Korea. As you can see, we got almost to the very, very end of it. And our general at the time, General MacArthur, actually advocated conquering China, which had also fallen to communism. But before that could happen, China actually joined an alliance with North Korea, and you can see they push back until eventually we have this neutral zone. And if you see in the bottom left-hand corner right there, that armistice line still exists today. We have signed an agreement with North Korea to stop firing at each other, but we've never actually signed a treaty with Korea. So technically speaking, we're still at war with them. And yeah, that's the little armistice line that's still going on today that I think Trump, either this year or late last year, actually went to that armistice line and shook the hands of Kim Jong-un. All right, so quick thing on China. This is a really, really fast overview of China, which again, I hope you'll learn more about next year when you go to U.S. history. But brief history. So pre-World War II, there was a civil war in China between communist forces and nationalist forces that were more capitalist. Chiang Kai-shek, the second slide right there, was the nationalist leader of China who we supported, and Mao Zedong was the communist leader of China. And they paused their civil war when World War II happened, when they were fighting Japan. But after World War II ended, the civil war picked up once again, and the communist forces were eventually able to win. And Mao ended up ruling most of China, and Chiang Kai-shek actually ran and was able to actually establish his authority still in a very small island, Taiwan. But generally speaking, China fell to communism, and to this day is still a communist country. All right, looking at the slide right here, the big white area right in the top left corner, that is communist China. And I know you can't really see it, but you see that little small little island next to China, that is Taiwan. That was supposedly capitalist. Now today, Taiwan is still part of China, technically, although there's still like divisions of government and there's still resistance to that communist rule that goes on right there. The picture on the right is an example of Mao Zedong. So that's how he looks right there. He ruled China through its first infancy of being communist before it moved on to other leaders. And this picture right here is just another picture highlighting the fact that you can see Taiwan as a small little island versus China. This picture also gives you an idea of where North Korea was during this battle that happened in the Korean Wars, because you see the borders right next to North Korea and South Korea border right next to China. In Vietnam, is another big conflict, which is a small little slither of country just south of China. If you go back to that previous slide, you can actually see Vietnam on there. So Vietnam decides it wants to start becoming communist, possibly. But for Vietnamese viewpoint of this war, I would point out they were actually a colony of France for much of its history. And after World War II ended, a lot of those rebels against the French rule didn't see themselves as communist rebels necessarily. They really saw themselves as rebels against imperialism, against French control. And we ended up supporting the French. And once the French ended up giving up, we really took over the war. And we ended up fighting in the Vietnam War for decades and decades and decades, like 3 to 4 decades constantly. There was this fight over the Vietnam War. And really, we were more technologically more advanced than the North Vietnamese communists. So really, most battles we ended up winning. However, again, decades and decades and decades, it really started this anti-war movement in the United States, where essentially it's kind of like, can we just end this war where hundreds and thousands of American soldiers are going to this foreign country that most Americans don't really care about and dying in the name of communism, which, we should just end it, let them be communism, basically let Vietnam take care of themselves. After decades and decades of dying, we should just end it. The leader of the communist forces, so you can see in that second bullet point, was Ho Chi Minh. And I would like to point out, it was divided between North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam was capitalist. And after we left, unfortunately from our perspective, I would say North Vietnam is able to conquer South Vietnam. And then to this day, Vietnam is a communist country. So this slide's just giving you some images from there. So on the left, you have Ho Chi Minh. He's the leader of the North Vietnamese forces that become communist. There's a little image of Vietnam. And if you see right there, that red line, one of the things that the North Vietnamese forces would do is that they would get into Laos and Cambodia, travel through that supposedly neutral countries, and then attack South Vietnam that way. And the last picture you got right there is the thing I was talking about in Americans not really wanting to fight this war. Love, not war. There was a lot of conflict against the government just trying to end this war. Why are we fighting this? War weariness going on. All right, so back to the Soviet Union and what we call the collapse of communism. So eventually, the Soviet Union's going to collapse in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. And some of the reasons for that collapse is economically, they just couldn't keep up with capitalism. Trying to one-up shipbuilding, their space program, and trying to compete for influence around the world. Eventually, the Soviet Union just couldn't handle that anymore and started falling apart economically. And one of the worries, of course, with that was that the Soviet Union broke out was the chaos that's happening. So it was actually a slow falling apart going down right there. One of the big symbols of the falling apart of the Soviet Union was the Berlin Wall. So remember, Berlin was divided half was communist, half was capitalist. So there was a wall that got put up around the capitalist part of Berlin so that the communist people wouldn't run over to the capitalist part, which was actually doing better. So eventually, Ronald Reagan, our president in the 1980s, eventually said, "Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall." And in 1989, in November, the wall was torn down. And that was seen as the symbolic end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union didn't officially fall, I think, until really 1992. So here's just some images right here of the Berlin Wall. You can see symbolically a bunch of people came together and tore down that wall to make supposedly freedom and stuff right there. And then you have Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was the last leader of the Soviet Union, and he's the guy that really led the Soviet Union when it was starting to fall apart. And basically, I wouldn't say he was the cause of the Soviet Union falling apart, because again, I think it was a lot of systems that built up over time. So he was really just trying to guide the Soviet Union and try to hold it together and basically controlled, I guess, falling apart so it wouldn't descend into chaos. Here's one of my little favorite political cartoons of the Soviet Union. Eventually, the Soviet Union falls apart, and a lot of I think it forms about 14 different countries that now exist today from the remnants of the Soviet Union. The largest country is Russia, but you can see there's a whole bunch of other smaller countries in Eastern Europe and also in Asia as well that formed out as a result of the Soviet Union collapsing. The last slide I want you to do is just highlighting some of those important leaders. So Indira Gandhi, it was the leader of India during the Cold War. And one of the things that I think is interesting about it is it's called like the non-alignment. So again, the idea that you're either with us or against us. Well, if you think about India, well, she's like, I don't really care about the Soviet Union really, or the United States. I just really wants to do with India. So she really just play alliances off each other, which whoever give her the best deal. And she eventually herself also develops a nuclear weapon, and eventually Pakistan develops a nuclear weapon. And if you know anything about Pakistan and India, Hindus versus Muslims, they don't really like each other. So there was a lot of worries, even to this day, that if a nuclear war ever does happen, it might even it'll end up happening with Pakistan and India, not the Soviet Union and the United States. Another big leader we want you guys to know is Margaret Thatcher. She was the 1980s Prime Minister of England, and she was kind of seen as the English version leader of Ronald Reagan. So she believed in free trade, less government. Remember, capitalism is less government. And like I said, she and Ronald Reagan formed a very, very close relationship together. And both of them, you can see right there, I like this little point right here, were not afraid to use military force if necessary to assert their authority, especially against capitalist forces. Or in the case of Margaret Thatcher, England still did have some colonies, so she would even use her military force or threat of military force to keep that whatever remnants of the empire alive. Gorbachev, I've already mentioned. Glasnost and perestroikas were just those ideas of lessening government restrictiveness and government control in their country as he's leading it to the end of the Soviet Union. The last person I'll talk about is Deng Xiaoping. He was a leader of communist China, one of the leaders after Mao Zedong. And you see one of the things that happens, as I mentioned, communism as an economic system is not really viable in the long term. And even if you look at China today, you'll notice they're not really a communist society. In fact, they have a lot of capitalists going on there with their market economy going on right there. And now China does have these private companies, like the Google, their version of Google, their version of Amazon. However, I like to point out they still are a dictatorship. Like a lot of those big companies are controlled by their government. They're just, I guess they're companies, but the major stakeholders are, government officials. And these are just some pictures of these big leaders. So on the left, you got Gorbachev, you got Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, not related to the Gandhi you're probably thinking of, and Xiaoping right there. All right, so that's it for your notes today for this module that you guys need to do. As a reminder, part 2 of your module, you need to go on your Teams and do the Cold War web quest. You do not actually have to, you have to submit the web quest, but you don't have to upload anything to me. After you've done going through that web quest and it's submitted, you should be able to get feedback from their submissions where I write down the answers, this is what I would have written the answers, so you know what you got right or wrong. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a reminder or send me an email, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, you have 2 weeks to do this, so you have this week and next week to get all this stuff done, and then you'll have one last unit on the globalization. So please take care, guys. Stay safe.